Daniel had worked on the outer trading station for nearly 3 years, fixing broken starship engines and patching old power grids, living among the noise of machines and the silence of space. Yet nothing in his life prepared him for the night. A stranger stopped at his small workshop with a request that shook him to the core. For when he turned and saw her, he realized immediately she was not human. Her skin shimmered faintly under the flickering neon lights, like pale silver touched by moonlight, and her eyes were too large, too luminous, carrying the sadness of someone who had lost more than she could bear. And when she spoke, her voice trembled with both fear and determination as she said softly, almost as if ashamed of her own words, "Human, I need you for just one night," which made Daniel freeze, because it was not a normal request in a place where traders usually asked only for fuel, repairs, or directions. And though he tried to dismiss the meaning, her gaze held him like chains, and she stepped closer, explaining that her name was Leora and that her people were dying. A race scattered across the stars, their numbers shrinking every cycle because their genes had weakened through centuries of isolation, and only those with outside blood could save them. Yet almost no one was willing, since humans rarely trusted her kind and her kind rarely dared to ask. But desperation had driven her into this dark corner of the station to beg a stranger for help, and Daniel could see that every word hurt her pride, every syllable cut at her dignity. Yet she spoke with the courage of someone who no longer had a choice, and though he wanted to ask 100 questions, he only managed to whisper, "Why? Me?" To which she answered that she had watched him before entering, seen the way he treated even the smallest machine with care, never rushing, never cursing. And she believed that a man who could treat metal with patience might treat her with respect. And Daniel felt something stir in his chest, a mix of sympathy, fear, and an odd pull he could not explain. For he knew she was not lying. The cracks in her voice told him this was truth, raw and heavy. And still he could not bring himself to reply at once, because the weight of what she asked was enormous, far beyond fixing an engine or patching a hull. This was about life itself, about becoming part of a fate he never imagined. And in the silence that followed, the faint hum of the station's generators echoed like the heartbeat of some unseen giant, making the moment feel endless. And Daniel wondered if this was a trap, if she belonged to one of the criminal clans that haunted the outer sectors. But then he saw her hands trembling as she tried to hold them steady, saw the way she clutched a small pendant at her neck, as though it was the last piece of home she carried, and he realized she was not dangerous, only desperate, a soul standing on the edge of extinction. And though he should have walked away, told her that she was asking the impossible, something deep in him, something that had been buried under years of loneliness, kept him rooted to the spot, listening as she confessed that even if she carried his child, she did not expect him to stay, did not ask for love or loyalty, only the chance to give her people one more hope, one more child, one more heartbeat against the silence of the void. And as Daniel listened, he remembered the long years he had spent drifting from one job to another, never forming bonds, never daring to start a family, because war and loss had taken too much from him back on Earth. Yet now here was a woman from another world asking him for something so human, so fragile, that it felt like the universe itself was mocking the emptiness of his life. And he could not escape the thought that maybe, just maybe, this request was not only about saving her kind, but also about saving something inside him that he thought had died long ago. And still the fear remained, the fear of consequences, of what others would say if they knew, of how this choice could bind him to a destiny he had never sought. But as Leora lowered her gaze and whispered that if he refused she would ask no more, she would leave quietly and never trouble him again, Daniel felt the decision tightening around him like the walls of the station pressing closer. And though his mouth was dry, though his heart hammered in his chest, he found himself stepping toward her instead of away, his shadow crossing hers under the neon glow. And he realized that this night was only the beginning of something larger than either of them could yet imagine. And in that moment, the request she had spoken became more than words. It became the turning point of two lives colliding at the edge of the stars. Daniel stood in silence after her request, his mind torn between reason and instinct, between the life he knew and the life she hinted at. And though every part of him screamed that this was madness, he could not push away. The image of her trembling hands, her eyes filled with unspoken fear, so he asked her to sit, offering the old chair he kept in the corner of his workshop, and she lowered herself onto it slowly as though even the act of resting was heavy with burden. And then she began to explain in halting words the truth of her people, telling him how once her race had thrived on a green world with silver oceans and golden skies, but wars, plagues, and centuries of exile among the stars had broken them apart until their bloodlines grew too thin to endure, and those who survived now wandered in scattered fleets, trading knowledge and artifacts just to keep alive, yet none could stop the slow decline, for fewer children were born each cycle, and soon, perhaps within one generation, they would vanish entirely. And as Daniel listened, he felt the weight of her story pressing on him like the silence of deep space, for he knew what it was to lose. He had lost family, comrades, even the sense of belonging that once tied him to earth. But what she described was not the loss of one man or one family. It was the death of an entire people, a silence that would echo forever if nothing was done. And though he tried to remind himself he was just an engineer with no stake in galactic destinies, her words dug into him until he could no longer stand apart. And when she finished, her voice breaking, she looked at him not as a savior, but as a last chance. And Daniel, against all logic, found himself nodding, saying quietly that he would help her, that he would not turn away. And for the first time that night he saw her eyes widen, not with fear, but with the faintest spark of hope, fragile as starlight. And she asked him if he understood what his agreement meant, if he realized that once he chose this path there would be no return to the life of solitude he had known. But Daniel only replied that perhaps he had been waiting all along for something that gave his wandering some meaning. And as the words left his mouth he realized how true they were. For years he had drifted through jobs and stations with no anchor, no bond, and maybe this was the reason fate had brought him here. And though uncertainty filled him, he did not step back, and Leora, seeing his resolve, allowed herself a small smile, though it was touched by sadness, as if she feared that hope was too dangerous to hold. And together they sat in the dim workshop, two strangers bound by a promise neither had expected to make, while beyond the walls the great station drifted in the void, unaware that within one small corner, a decision had been forged that might alter not only two lives, but perhaps the future of an entire people. And as Daniel glanced at the flickering lights overhead, he could not shake the feeling that something greater was moving just beyond his sight, waiting for the moment when choice would turn into destiny. The hours after Daniel's agreement passed like a blur. The noise of the trading station muffled behind the closed door of his small workshop, and in that quiet space he felt the weight of his choice settle deeper with every moment. For though he had spoken the words without regret, the reality of what lay ahead pressed heavily on his mind, and he wondered if he truly understood what he had promised. While across from him Leora sat in silence, her silver-toned skin catching the pale light of the ceiling lamp, her hands folded tightly as though she feared that, if she let go, the fragile promise between them would vanish. And Daniel, watching her, sensed that she was more than the desperation she carried, that there was a story behind her calm eyes, a strength forged through years of struggle. And slowly he asked her about her life, not because he had to, but because he wanted to know the truth behind the stranger who had trusted him with so much. And as she spoke her voice softened, painting images of her lost world, of rivers that glowed in the dark and mountains that sang when the wind touched them. And Daniel closed his eyes, almost able to see it, almost able to believe that such a place had once existed. But then her tone shifted as she described the long years of exile, the families that dwindled, the children who never grew, and each word carried a weight that drew him deeper into her pain, until he realized he was no longer only agreeing to help her people. He was becoming part of her own personal fight to hold onto hope. And as the night grew darker outside the small round window, the distance between them began to fade, their words weaving a fragile thread that bound them closer, not through duty but through understanding. And Daniel found himself laughing softly at one of her stories about a young version of herself who once stole fruit from a market to feed her sick brother. And Leora, surprised by his laughter, smiled in a way that lit her entire face. a smile that carried both youth and sorrow. And in that moment Daniel realized that what had begun as an arrangement for survival was turning into something neither of them had expected. For it was no longer about a transaction, but about trust, about two souls reaching out to one another in the emptiness of space. And when silence finally fell between them, it was not the silence of strangers but the silence of people who no longer needed words to understand. And Daniel, feeling the pull of that silence, reached across the small table, his hand hesitating for only a breath before touching hers. And though her hand trembled, she did not pull away. Instead, she held his fingers with a quiet strength that spoke louder than any vow. And in that simple touch the air shifted, filled with a promise unspoken. A promise that this night would not be defined by fear or duty alone, but by the fragile spark of connection that had begun to grow between them. And as the station lights flickered once more, Daniel knew that when dawn came he would not be the same man he had been. For in choosing to stand beside her he had stepped onto a path that would change everything, and the night of choice had truly begun. When the pale glow of the artificial dawn seeped through the workshop's round window, Daniel opened his eyes to the soft hum of the station and the quiet presence of Leora sitting near him, her gaze fixed not on him but on the endless stars beyond the glass. And for a moment he wondered if the night before had been real or only a strange dream, born from his loneliness, yet the memory of her trembling hand in his own, the stories shared in whispers, and the heavy choice that bound them reminded him that this was no dream but a new reality he had stepped into. And as he rose slowly, his heart carried both an odd calm and a storm of uncertainty, for he knew that after agreeing to help her, life would never again return to its ordinary rhythm. And still, he felt no regret, only the question of what came next, while Leora, sensing his eyes upon her, turned and gave him a faint smile, a smile both grateful and cautious, as if she feared it might vanish if she leaned on it too much. And she thanked him in a voice so quiet it seemed almost broken, telling him that his kindness had already given her more than she expected, for she had thought he would refuse her plea, thought she would be turned away once again as she had been by so many others. And Daniel felt the sharp pang of that truth, realizing she had risked her pride, her dignity, perhaps even her safety, by approaching him, and yet she had done so with courage. And he knew then that her request had not only been about survival, but also about trust. Trust in a stranger she had chosen for reasons even she could not fully explain. And though he wished to answer her with something steady, something strong, he found his words caught in his throat. For deep down he was still afraid, afraid of the weight of destiny, afraid of the uncertain path ahead. But when she looked at him, her eyes shimmering faintly in the morning glow, he forced himself to speak, telling her that he would not walk away, not after what they had shared, not after hearing her story. And that simple vow seemed to lift something heavy from her, though he also saw the shadow of worry remain, as if she knew dangers still waited beyond the safety of his small workshop. For the galaxy was not kind to the weak, and whispers of her people's desperation might already have spread through the station's narrow corridors, drawing those who would seek to profit from her plight. And Daniel understood in that moment that the choice he made was no longer private, that unseen eyes and ears might soon test his resolve. Yet instead of stepping back, he felt a strange fire rising in him, a fire he had not felt in years. And he realized that perhaps the morning after was not an ending, but a beginning, the first true step into a story that had only just started. And as the station's announcement system crackled overhead, calling crews to their shifts, Daniel looked once more at Leora and silently promised himself that whatever trials came, he would not let her face them alone. The day on the station stretched long, filled with the steady hum of engines, the shuffle of traders in the corridors, and the distant echoes of docking ships. Yet within Daniel's workshop, the world seemed smaller, quieter, as though time itself hesitated around them. For though he worked with his tools, repairing a damaged power coil brought in by a miner, his thoughts never strayed far from Leora, who sat silently near the corner, her eyes always drifting to the window where the endless sea of stars stretched like an ocean, without shore. And Daniel wondered what storms brewed behind her calm face, what fears she carried that she refused to speak aloud. And by evening, when the station's lights dimmed to mimic night, he finally put down his tools, unable to keep his thoughts bottled any longer, and asked her what troubled her, and for a long time she said nothing, her fingers tracing the edge of the pendant around her neck as if drawing strength from it, until at last she admitted that she feared he would change his mind, that perhaps, when morning came again, he would see her as nothing more than a burden. And though Daniel had expected such doubts, the raw honesty in her words struck him deeply, and he felt the old ache of his own loneliness surface, for he too had lived with the fear of being unwanted, of being left behind, and he stepped closer, speaking not with grand promises, but with steady truth, telling her that he had no intention of leaving her, not tonight, not tomorrow, not as long as she needed him, and she shook her head, whispering that his words were kind, but that kindness was not the same as choosing to stay, not the same as giving his life to another's fate, and for a moment silence hung heavy between them, until Daniel leaned closer, his voice low but firm, carrying not hesitation but resolve, and he whispered the words she did not expect, words that made her eyes widen and her breath catch, words that were not born of duty or pity but of something deeper, something real, stay forever, and the weight of that whisper filled the room like thunder, though it was spoken as gently as a secret, and Leora, stunned, could only stare at him as if she had misheard. But when she saw the truth in his eyes, she realized he meant it. He was not binding himself with chains, but offering her something she had thought impossible, a place to belong not for one night, but for all nights, and her lips trembled as she tried to reply. Yet no words came, for her heart was caught between hope and fear, between the dream of being wanted and the terror of losing it, and Daniel, seeing her struggle, reached out and took her hand, once more, steadying her as he told her that this was not only her fight, that from the moment she walked into his workshop her battle had become his too, and that whatever awaited them beyond the safety of the station, they would face it together. And in that moment, the faint hum of the station seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of their joined breathing, the fragile bond between them now stronger than the silence of doubt. And though shadows of danger lingered just beyond their small corner of light, both knew that with those words whispered, their lives had crossed into something that could no longer be undone. The hours after Daniel whispered those words passed like a dream neither of them wanted to end. Yet reality was waiting beyond the thin walls of the workshop, for on a station filled with desperate traitors, wandering mercenaries, and eyes always searching for weakness, secrets never stayed hidden for long. And as Daniel and Leora prepared to leave the small space that had sheltered their first fragile bond, a message flashed across the worn display on his desk, a warning from an old friend who worked in the docking sector, telling him that rumors had begun to spread of a foreign woman seeking human help, and that men with sharp questions and sharper weapons were already asking where she might be. And Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his chest, for he understood that the choice he had made was now being tested sooner than he expected. Yet instead of fear there was a clarity in him, the kind that came when a man finally knew his path, and he turned to Leora and told her that it was no longer safe here, that if she wished to survive, if they wished to keep what they had begun, they needed to leave before the station closed its gates for the next cycle. And though she hesitated, torn between fear of running and fear of staying, she saw the resolve in his eyes and nodded, trusting him more than she trusted the metal walls around them. And so together they gathered what little they had, Daniel carrying only a bag of tools and a few credits while Leora carried nothing but her pendant, and they slipped into the crowded corridors, moving with the flow of workers returning from shifts, their hearts racing with every echo of boots on the floor, every glance from strangers who might see too much, until at last they reached the docking bay where Daniel's small ship waited, an old cargo hauler patched together from scrap yet sturdy enough to cross the stars. And as the bay lights flickered overhead, he guided her up the ramp, his hand never leaving hers. And when the hatch sealed behind them, the world outside seemed to vanish, leaving only the hum of engines and the trembling hope of a new beginning. And as he powered up the ship, voices and alarms echoed faintly from the dock below, proof that danger had not been left behind, but was only a step behind them. Yet when the thrusters roared and the stars stretched wide before them, Daniel felt no fear, only the steady fire of determination, for he had promised her forever. And in this fragile vessel that promise began its true journey, and Leora, sitting beside him, whispered that she had never felt so close to freedom, never felt the weight of her people's survival lift so much. And though shadows of uncertainty still lingered, she no longer faced them alone. For together they were no longer two lost souls, bound by desperation, but a new family forged in choice. And as the ship drifted away from the station into the endless night, the stars seemed brighter, as if the universe itself welcomed their vow. And Daniel knew deep in his heart that the new dawn was not just about survival, it was about building a future where love, trust, and hope could grow stronger than fear. A future they would create together, one day at a time, beneath the endless sky.